There's something special and something different and unique about the ASSAf Book Prize. Certainly, there are other prizes in South Africa, some important and prestigious ones. But many of those prizes tend to reward books that have got a sort of crossover appeal, that have strong scholarly credentials, but also books that'll sort of fly off the shelf in the local version of exclusive books or CNA or whatever shops populate this strange city at the bottom of the country. But the ASSAf Book Prize doesn't do that, although certainly some of the books do have a readership that far transcends the expected academic audience. And I think, for instance, of our 2021 winner, Charles van Aanselen's The Night Trains. But the ASSAf Book Prizes are awarded first and foremost for scholarly books. And they celebrate, above all, high quality scholarship. If a book is going to appeal to a group of philosophers or sociologists, or if it's theoretically inclined and speaks on one of the many strands of the Frankfurt School, it's going to be eligible for a prize from ASSAf if it's founded on the requisite sort of principles and pillars of good scholarship. Now, since the inauguration of this award in 2017, the idea of celebrating the book, it's pleasing that it seems to have seeded in many South African universities, and a number of them now have a book prize. Certainly the two I've been associated with recently, the University of the Free State and the University of Fort Hare, both have book prizes. And I'm sure that many of the universities which are represented by you here tonight have prizes which award books in the humanities. So it seems that there is some general, there's a growth in the idea of awarding the book, even though funding formula and subsidies don't necessarily or really award the idea of book publishing. Now, I'd like to believe that the ASSAf Award has been one of the engines driving that development. And since the beginning of these awards, we can see how the humanities and the disciplines and the fields and the mobilizing questions in them have changed. And this is just over the 6 or so years that we've been running this award. And there's been a move from work which has been seated in more conventional disciplines and sort of biographical canons to books that actively cross disciplines, even into fields considered part of the natural sciences, part of the law. And we've seen books in the current batch of entries for this year's book prize that really quite actively go about reimagining the disciplines and the fields in ways that are very specific to genealogies of South African scholarship and South African political, cultural, ethical, ecological concerns. Put differently, the scholarship which we are seeing in these books does more than claim to be sort of just regional iterations of, I suppose, the theory from the South or kind of South African versions of scholarship from elsewhere. And tonight we honor books that touch on migration and gender and nation, on gangs and society, and despair and its more pleasant alter ego, hope. We also see environmental projects, decoloniality, the circulation of ideas, the organization of knowledge and effect. And some of these certainly are ideas which we've seen before, but the 2023 books are all motivated by new, fresh, theoretical, methodological, ethical, and political concerns. So, in a sense, these books, the 40 or so which represented the entry list for this year's prize, become something of a barometer for where the humanities in this country are. And this showcasing, I think, is that ASSAf needs to be doing if it's also to nurture the humanities. And this year, for the first time, we've got 2 prizes in this book award. We have an emerging category and an established category. And as you all know, a second or a third book has a very different texture to a first book. First books, we know, tend to emerge from doctoral theses, and they tend to retain the legacies of being disciplined into a discipline. And subsequent books do, of course, tend to be more fluent, with less need to show one's competence in a discipline as a historian or an English language scholar or a philosopher or whatever the case might be. And both kinds of books are of high value to the scholar, to the academy, to the corpus of knowledge which we draw on collectively. But we did consider it a little unfair to line up these 2 very different kinds of books against each other. And ASSAf, especially under the leadership of Professor Jansen and Professor Sujal, has been committed to nurturing the emergence of a new generation of scholars. And we've thus decided with this year's award to have these 2 awards rather than to put all books, different kinds of books, together to compete for the same award. I'd like to thank those who served on the adjudication panel, not too many of whom are here tonight, but I do see Professor John Higgins from the University of Cape Town, Professor Zethu Matabeni from my home institution, Fort Hare, Professor Nhlanhla Mpofu from Stellenbosch, Dr. Naomi Nkela from Wits, Professor Vasu Reddy from do I call him the University of Pretoria or the University of Free State? But he's migrating. Professor Siana O'Connell from the University of Pretoria, and Professor Crane Sedin from NMU and the University of Cape Town. And I'd like particularly to thank the ASSAf staff, Mrs. Susan Feltzman, who's Director of the Scholarly Publishing Program, and Ms. Maputi Rametse, who's the Project Officer in the Scholarly Publishing Program. And once again, Professor Himla Sujal. Is Himla here tonight? That's a great pity. Himla has been a great friend and an ally of the humanities, of these book awards, and indeed the idea of emerging scholarship. And finally, but not least, I'd like to thank all of you for coming here tonight to join us in celebrating these marvelous books. And I hope that you have a great time. And at this point, I'm going to call on Professor Crane Sedin.
Thanks very much, Neil. And thanks for that contextualization of what's going on here. So, colleagues, really great to see all of you. What I am to do here is give you a short background to what we have done in this committee and the processes we followed in making these awards. So I've been involved with this award since its inception, John Higgins and I. We started when the inaugural award was made in 2016 for Keith Breckenridge's really great book, The Biometric State. If you haven't read it yet, please do. Since then, we've made an award to Dr. Jabani Mangani in 2018 for his really important book, Parasite in the Making of a Black Psychologist. And immediately after that, Kapana Ratelli put out a book which was in a big conversation with that book around the field of psychology and where psychology is at in the country. Really important. And then lastly, Neil mentioned our award to Charles van Onselen in 2020 for his Night Trains. Important about that book is, for me, was the last chapter, which essentially spoke to Charles's making, the formation of Charles, and it was really important also. So we're now here at the fourth time that this award is being made. This award arises directly out of the ASSAf consensus study, which came out in 2011, which some of you may remember. And that consensus study looked at the place and role accorded to the humanities and the need to look at ways of supporting scholarly work in the humanities alongside of, and there's a big debate going on in ASSAf at that time, Wieland and people there will remember it, about how to be bringing more prominence to humanities kinds of research. And an important decision was made to establish at that particular point a humanities standing committee. This humanities standing committee tried, didn't succeed, to change the name of ASSAf. To bring in a sense of what the humanities were all about, and the debate floundered on the argument that science was sufficiently encompassing of all kinds of knowledge. But what the Humanities Standing Committee did do was to make an argument for establishing this book award. It comes out of a recommendation that was made by the consensus study, which spoke of the need to, and I'm quoting them now, to enhance the book as a cultural and human asset in both the scholarly and public mind. So here we are here now as a consequence of that. And thanks, Neil, for talking about the decision being made last year to not to split this award. The prize remains unaltered, I think, the monetary prize. So it's not splitting, we're not splitting the prize money. We've simply managed to get ASSAf to find a little bit more money to acknowledge young scholars. So colleagues, having been involved in all four occasions when this award has been made, I've been struck each time by the depth of our humanities community. It is in the world a substantial and significant community of people who are producing scholarship which sits right at the center of the broad humanities, in the questions that are being raised and the analyses and explanations of the human condition that are being proposed. And so we have no reason to be anxious about what our leading scholars are producing. How do we go about selecting books for this prize? We go through an adjudication process which, as you might imagine, is simultaneously arduous, but thoroughly inspiring. We, those of us who've had the privilege to be involved, learn a lot. There are technical factors, of course, that we have to consider, like ISBN numbers and so on, and is this a vanity press publication, and lots of things of that kind. But we look for books which are in the first and primary instance works of scholarship. So you might say, are you clear about that? Are you clear about what a scholarly book entails? And I'd like to say largely yes, but not entirely. We still fight and argue a great deal in this committee. By the way, we may not be there the next time, John, so the life of this committee will carry on in the person of people like Neil. But we argue about what it is that is important about human existence. We argue about how the scholarship comes to address questions about our relationships with each other in all of the dimensions: psychological, ecological, political, economic, and however else you might think about our desires and our dislikes. But it is this requirement that the book is going to increase our understanding of the condition of ourselves as human beings. In addition to this, and this is perhaps technical, we stipulate that the book is non-fiction because we think that there are many other occasions and opportunities for fiction writers to be acknowledged. We are not averse, however, to creative humanities work. And in this, we are open to all forms by which the scholarship can be, through a text, represented. We're still waiting for texts like that, though. We haven't yet found them. We also deliberately exclude edited collections and textbooks. These, we argue, have other virtues which could be acknowledged elsewhere. But we really are keen to see what new insights a scholar, him, her, or themselves, we accept co-authored works, may be making about the state of our world. Nominations must have an affiliation to a South African institution. And we acknowledge the fact that we have lots of scholars in our midst, in our institutions, who carry other passports. So, as you can imagine, we have many applications and nominations. This year we had over 40. The process of sifting through these submissions takes time. The way we do it is to divide ourselves into pairs. And each pair is given a pile of books to work through. These pairs then bring between them a report to the collective panel, and then the argument begins. The debate begins about what should be not advanced. And it's really a question about that. What's not going to go forward? And we land up then with a short list of books that we think should go forward. This short list we try to keep as short as possible, but it's difficult. This year we landed up with a short list of about 6 books, I think. Those 6 books, all of us in the panel, this time there were about 8 or 10, all of us read those books, those shortlisted books, cover to cover, no skimping. And we then come back to a final meeting, which decides then who the winner is. And I want to say to you, we don't completely agree. We come to a rough agreement, but it's not a complete agreement. But our process is rigorous, and I'd like to think fair. We do justice, I think, to these submissions in front of us. Of course, we can always get better, but I think we largely get it right. We are, I must tell you, uncomfortable with metrics, particularly these accountability metrics that we now have, which promote extraordinarily individualized and competitive mind academic sensibilities. And we try really hard to mitigate that as much as we can. And we do this by acknowledging that sometimes 2 books may be equally worthy. as we have done this year. So after the last award, and I'll close with this, when we acknowledged Charles van Onselen, I was asked to write a short account of what happened in this process for the ASSAf Journal, the South African Journal of Sciences. I said in that report that we are, with this process, building a culture. We are building a culture of the humanities. What we've done, I think, with this fourth award here is to deepen that culture. We are moving to make it a feature of our humanities landscape. We celebrate our winners, but we honor the larger community of scholars working hard to make books count. To count in the very best sense. To count to the point of making a difference for all of us. My congratulations to all of our scholars. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody, to this fine occasion in a beautiful spot. And it's so interesting to hear reviewed, the processes which brought this book award into being and which have kept it going through time. And I'm sure you're all interested to hear a little bit about the, as Crane said, the arduous but very stimulating process of reading all these books. And I think we can say from that, the humanities and social sciences are alive and well in the country, and that the prize-winning books are really, really meritorious in any terms. In fact, this year, we really had a bit of a problem when it came to that final selection, because we finally managed to settle on, well, we couldn't quite finally manage to settle on 2 winners. We went for 3. But then that was also very difficult. So to be absolutely honest with our collective perceptions and understandings of the value of the works which we were reading, we decided, what the hell, let's add another category of honourable mention. Because there were quite a lot of books this year, and they were all pretty good. And, well, we really thought that we needed this other category of honourable mention, which technically means that these books received the very high commendation from the judging panel, though not winning by narrow but visible margins in terms of the sorts of criteria we were using of range, depth of scholarship, relevance, and so on and so forth. But it was close. So I think with equal pleasure, we should celebrate the 3 honourable mentions. And that's what I'm here to talk briefly about. The honourable mentions go to two researchers. Again, you can see the troubles, not just one, but 2 researchers in the established researcher category, who both happen to be in the English department at the University of Stellenbosch, Professors Louise Green and Tina Steiner. And then in the emerging researcher category, a 3rd honourable mention to Rick de Villiers from the English department at the University of the Free State. These 3 works are all outstanding and exemplary works of humanist scholarship and academic labour. And they were picked, along with the actual winners, for the straightforward qualities of expression, originality, depth of research, thoroughness of argument, just the scholarly virtues. With Louise Green's, I'm just talk briefly about them because you won't be having talks from the honourable mention people, so I just want to tell a little bit about the books in this category. With Fragments from the History of Loss, Professor Louise Green shows, the committee felt, what it really means to understand and make use of, make original use of, a complex body of theoretical writing and thinking. And the theory here was that of the Frankfurt School writer of the post-war period, a German Jew writing in exile from the happy land of California, USA, which he hated in many ways, Theodor Adorno. In particular, his great work, Minima Moralia, Reflections from a Damaged Life, serves as the model for Louise Green's highly original study with its subtitle, The Nature Industry and the Post-Colony. Crane's mentioned this kind of thing before, but one of the attributes of the book was that it examines one of the two great crises of our time, the threat of ecological catastrophe, as the other Green book does as well. Green's Green Book examines the history of conspicuous consumption and the exploitation of Africa and surfaces some of the main myths and fantasies that have brought us into the catastrophic present which we're living through, arguing fundamentally and in line with what humanities is about, that it's the relation between people and not the relation to nature which needs to be addressed if we are to thrive or even survive. And what was most striking here, and what drew the committee's particular attention to the work, is that Professor Green manages this strange scholarly task, which we all know, which is about to what depth do you take in and inhabit what you're reading? And somehow Professor Green manages the task, and it seems really unusual for a South African, to inhabit a German Jew in exile's aphoristic and lapidary style as a way of thinking things through. And in the arguments of the book, the very sentences of the book, well, they don't just summarize and apply Adorno's arguments as kind of run-of-the-mill scholarship might. They actually create and perform a space for critical thinking, sentence by sentence. And that is the result of extraordinary academic labour. The book as a whole performs what it is so often lost to banal academic writing, style as thinking in action, which is crucial to the humanities, and something which yields unexpected and original understandings for which this book deserves an honourable mention. Professor Tina Steiner's study, Convivial Worlds, addresses what is surely the second and related great crisis of our time, the ongoing crisis, with a long history but really exacerbated in the present, of migration. Oh, this is one way of reading it. It's a work which is driven and possessed by its theme, conviviality And I'm glad that we're here on a convivial occasion to celebrate such a book. And conviviality is perhaps one of the most important new, but then nothing new is under the sun, we humanists know, new or rather revived and brought back to life terms which really can contribute to our understanding of social and political dynamics and also enable our own social and political agency. I mean, I'm not going to go into, well, I'd like to, but then I'd have to speak for an hour, which I'd enjoy, but you might get a bit bored. In the simplest terms, conviviality refers to the practices of living together across differences and diversities in highly unequal societies in which we live and have our being. And it's perhaps the necessary concept of our time as border walls, as both literal, as in the USA, Trump's wall between Mexico, the USA, or that between North and South Korea, and also more figuratively in the divisions between groups that underlie the vicious conflicts in the Sudan, Ethiopia, actually far too many countries to name. Conviviality seeks to address those profound issues of our time. And Professor Steiner's study of writings that cross the boundaries, literal and figurative, is there a word that brings both together, between Africa and South Asia and Europe, attends to the human realities, the fantasies of border walls seek to disavow, the reality of our inescapable togetherness and the creative ways and energies which can help to create the common ground that we must have to bridge otherwise cataclysmic differences and work towards what Professor Steiner calls an alternative sociality. For its original and thought-provoking analyses that the putting to work of the concept of conviviality achieves, as well as for the timeliness of that bringing back to life, Convivial Worlds also receives an honourable mention here this evening. And finally, but definitely last but not least, in the category of emerging researcher, Rick de Villiers receives an honourable mention for his very original study, Eliot and Beckett, Low Modernism, Humility and Humiliation. Now, this is an exemplary work in the singular clarity of its argument and the marshalling of its considerable primary and secondary resources. Its organising focus is highly original. Ideas of the relations between two terms, humility and humiliation, that actually we prefer not to think about, but which is everywhere around us. With its focus on states of abjection, shame, the destructions of suffering, the book brings to the light of our attention difficult feelings which we often prefer to consign to the margins of our attention. This book is noteworthy as well for the extraordinary scrutiny it brings to the use and return of individual words in the thousands of pages of writing which he surveys, individual images, phrases, and turns of speech in the extraordinary writings of Samuel Beckett and T.S. Eliot, in ways that offer the readers to understand something of the works of these writers from the inside. And that's the extraordinary thing about the task of here specifically literary criticism, that it can take you inside the thinking and being of people who are dead and gone. It's the most extraordinary achievement. It's perhaps worth mentioning that all the books in this honourable mention category happen, or is it happen, to be from the humanities and not the social sciences, and from literature departments. These are the departments which prioritise the intensive labour of reading and interpretation, which are often just taken for granted, as well as the vivid pleasures and deep understandings of our social, cultural, and political worlds that these acts of reading and interpretation can bring. So please join me in a round of applause for these worthy winners of the ASSAf Honourable Mention category, especially as they don't get any money.
Thank you very much, John, for a marvellous elucidation of some wonderful, wonderful texts which came close to winning but didn't win. And it was something which troubled me slightly with previous iterations of the award, that, you know, we picked a winner and we had a function where we honoured that book, yet there were so many brilliant books which were very close to winning, which didn't feature at the awards event. So the innovation manifest in what John's just done is done so marvelously, I think, is a very important element of what we've done this year with the book awards. These were absolutely fantastic books, and I think it is interesting that while we struggled and battled with the final rank order and with making, I suppose, what we call the long short list, the committee were not very troubled in finding the three which went through in each category to be evaluated. Nearly everyone agreed on the top three, and then, of course, we couldn't quite figure out which one would win then, and that led to some long meetings and much debate, because these were all massively brilliant books. I'm going to talk a little bit about the emerging researcher book, and again, two excellent books here, and we tried for a heck of a long time, a Fort-Hare-length meeting to try and differentiate between the books which were at the top of our rank order. But I think it was unfortunate that we had an even number of panelists, so we couldn't have a tiebreaker. So we decided to do the logical thing, and we agreed that two books needed to be awarded the emerging researcher books. The panel was absolutely deadlocked, and I'm delighted to announce the two winners tonight. It's Camminga, who is a postdoc at the African Centre for Migration and Society at WITS, with the book Transgender Refugees in the Imagined South Africa. And the other winner is Dariusz Dziewanski, who's a research affiliate at the Centre for Criminology in the law faculty at the University of Cape Town, for a book called Gang Entry and Exit in Cape Town, Getting Beyond the Streets of South Africa's Deadliest City. Now, we're going to hear more about these books in a moment, but just a few snippets from what the panel observed. I should have been a minute taker, because I always make ugly handwritten notes of meetings, and I went through my notes from our discussion of these and some of the points which came up. On Camminga's book, one of the panelists pointed out that they do something very interesting in offering at once what is a rigorous, systematic data-driven scientific inquiry that also demonstrates a very potent storytelling technique. It's a very layered book that recognizes and gives meaning, yet integrates different aspects of life related to nation-making and migration and identity and gender. And it's a book that shows a great sense of compassion, which is something we tend, I think, to forget, especially in perhaps some of the more social science end of the spectrum of books in the humanities and social sciences. This is a book written with care, with feeling, with empathy towards the people who feature in the book. It engages with both racial science and medical science, and it counters a whole lot of very simplistic narratives about nation, about gender, about migration, about arriving in South Africa, and about negotiating life in South Africa as someone who doesn't have a South African ID book. Dr. Dziewanski's book really, the panel felt, moved criminology research in powerful ways. It is quite potent in how it works and describes the dialectic between structure and agency. And that particular tension, which I suppose is something which has vexed historians in this country or anthropologists for quite a while, comes through very poignantly in the narratives that and the life stories that Dr. Dziewanski makes use of. And he takes up Bordeaux's abstract ideas to examine what it's like to be living inside these social worlds, and applies it to the subjects whom he writes about. And he lived with the people with whom he writes. So these are two marvelous, marvelous books. And I'm going to ask Professor Jonathan Jansen, President of ASSAf, to come and talk briefly about these books. And then Maputi and Susan will have to correct me if I'm wrong with the procedures, but then I believe we're going to have a short video presentation on each book, and then I'm going to ask Professor Jansen to present the certificates to the winners. So Professor Jansen, over to you.
No, I think we've heard enough about the books. I want to give these people some money and awards and so on and so forth. Let me just do a few ceremonial things. First of all, as I like to do at these ASSAf events, is to acknowledge the people on whose shoulders we stand. And so the first thing I want to do is just thank Professor Wieland Gewes for being here this evening. When I visited him at his home, he showed me the actual desk on which he wrote the ASSAf Act, you know. And because of him and his incredible leadership, we are here today. So thank you, Wieland, for your enormous energy and commitment to the establishment of the Academy. The Academy of Sciences has had great presidents. You know, and often they go on to greater things. I believe we've just given an Academy president to the UCT Vice Chancellorship and so on. So, you know, we, even if it's on an interim basis, they go great places. So I want to thank this committee for working extremely hard to choose these books. And you can see what both Crane, John, and Neil, they really get into these books, you know, as humanities scholars tend to do. And to thank you and your panel for the enormous effort that you put into that work. Something you might not know. When you're a member of this panel, you cannot put into contention your own book. And I felt very sad about that a year or two ago, because Crane had a book that I thought was a world beater, and it's a book on Cape Town intellectuals. And he, as many of you would know Crane, as a person without much ego, enormous humility, he didn't participate, didn't put in his book because of his role in and so on. So once again, thank you to all of you for doing that. So I would like to ask that we immediately go over into the video in which I think one of the awardees will say a few words. Is that correct? Is julle reg daar agter? Baie dankie. Let's go to the first colleague. Those of you who follow the news will realize that the Lesotho Parliament this week is debating whether parts of South Africa should be given back to Lesotho, like the Free State, parts of the Northern Cape, and so on and so forth. So I thought that was a great idea. But the notion of borders and their construction and the sensitive and important subject of transgender identity is something really, really crucial for us to focus on. So before we go to the next person, could I ask the person representing the winner to come up here? And then, is it Susanna, somebody who will join me here?
Yeah, Jonathan, it's Professor from
Professor De Wet-Billings, you are very welcome. And congratulations. For that. I suppose the check is in the mail, but you'll just have to take my word for that.
I am beyond honoured to receive this award. My thanks to the Academy of Science of South Africa and the Selection Committee for reading and selecting transgender refugees in the Imagine South Africa for this extraordinary distinction, and congratulations to my co-winner, Dr. Dariusz Dziewanski. I am deeply disappointed that I'm not there in person this evening, but equally grateful that Prof. Nicole De Wet-Billings is there on my behalf. I'd like to thank Prof. De Wet-Billings and Prof. Garth Stevens and Wits University for nominating my work. I want to acknowledge the participants in this project. Without their trust in me to tell their stories, none of this would be possible. They have undertaken unimaginable journeys, both in coming to South Africa and in coming to themselves. Some have moved and been resettled in the global north in the interim between the ending of the project and the publication of the book and the moment we find ourselves in now. But given the ongoing political shifts across some parts of this continent and indeed some parts of the world, others have arrived also seeking safety in their wake, and I have no doubt many more will continue to do so. As the book shows, we have a long and tangled history with gender identity and expression in South Africa. I am invested in feminist, queer, and trans futures, and my work remains concerned with issues relating to gender identity and expression on the African continent. My current work continues to explore this history and these themes and the relation they have to the African continent and indeed now the broader African transgender diaspora. Special thanks to Prof. Zethu Matabeni, Prof. Susan Levine, and Prof. Deborah Posel for being an exceptional supervisory team who not only supported this project, but made room for me as a transgender person and space for the challenges of my own transition. I also want to thank my partner, Ruth Ramsden Carlsa, for her brilliance and her ever-presence. I must say I cried after receiving the phone call from Prof. Neil Roos. I specifically want to thank the committee for their kind words, engagement, and encouragement. Work like this can be daunting, and in the ever-shifting terrain of the Academy, both in South Africa and globally, the recognition means a great deal. It perhaps means even more to receive this award at this time in the world. Greater understanding, empathy, and engagement is needed now more than ever. I hope this book continues to shift the landscape of research and engagement around transgender and gender diverse lives and what we think it is that gender is and does across and beyond the African continent. Thank you so much again. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and congratulations to all the other awardees.
we like to see you in person. On Monday and Tuesday, a group of us, 12 people from around the world, sat together, sketching a book on what comes after decolonization. Crane was with me and a few others from SOAS and Liverpool and Wits and other parts of the country. And towards the end of the second day, Crane put up his phone just as Siseko Khumalo was speaking and said, "Did you know what happened?" and so on. And this is what happened. A colleague with whom I was teaching on the Future Professors program last week, the M3 or the M5 was closed, the direct route to the airport. And so Gert van der Westhuizen puts on his GPS, and as it often does with Uber drivers who are not familiar with the streets of Cape Town, took them through Malmberg and Gugulethu. And the moment he went through Gugulethu, a rock hit the car on the side and did great damage to his wife's head. She went into ICU, and a few days later, at that moment in our book discussion, she dies. Shit got real. This kind of book is so important to shed light on the dangers. As I was sitting here just now, I just said to myself, we live in two worlds. We live in this world that is so pristine, so beautiful, so incredible. And there's another world right here in the Cape in which there are gangs and criminality in what the description says is Africa's deadliest city. I want to thank you for your book. I want to thank you for congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, but I think just a few thank yous are obviously in order to the Academy. Thank you to the Academy. I'll probably never get to say that in my life because there's not an Oscar that I'll be winning, but for celebrating research of such diversity, I think we don't see that enough. Thank you to the Center for Criminology, which took the initiative to submit my book. I don't know anything about academic awards or the submission processes, but big thank you for their initiative. And my biggest debt of gratitude is owed to the people that participated in this book. So not just the 24 case or life histories that were sort of at the forefront of the book, but the hundreds of other discussions that I had. And I tried to add to a piece of literature that was missing. There's a lot of focus on gang entry, gang participation, but there's very little hope, I think, from the research that's out there, just because it doesn't seem like it's possible to get out of gangs, right? And the 24 life histories that I pictured or that I depicted in this book show that it is possible, but they also show, and I tried to write it in such a way that it shows with great depth how difficult it is, right? It's not just a change of heart or an act of will, but it's an act of great perseverance, or many, many great acts of perseverance that are taken over a period of time. And sometimes you have steps back, steps forward, steps to the side. And I'm a big believer in deep ethnographic work to show sort of the humanity of especially a topic like this, which is often painted with such broad strokes, seen as something that's moralistic, something that's policed. Policymakers don't really have time for qualitative work in the same way that they do standardized quantitative work. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think that we need more of this type of work. So thank you for recognizing it. Again, a big debt of gratitude to the people that let me into their lives. It's not possible to write ethnographic work, to write deeply with humanity unless somebody expresses and shows you that humanity. So big thank you to them and to everybody else and the awardees. Thanks.
This year, the award for the established researcher is going to go to Lesley Green, who's professor Professor of Anthropology and Director of Environmental Humanities South at the University of Cape Town. Lesley has held a stellar list of fellowships. She's been a Fulbright at University of California, Santa Cruz, a Mandela Fellow at Harvard, a Rockefeller Humanities Fellow at the Smithsonian, and a Cheney Fellow at Leeds. And this book, she tells me, emerges from the network she forged around colleagues at UCT with the support from various humanities deans, the Mellon Foundation, the Environmental Humanities South Group, and the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. She also attributes the Fallist movement at UCT, UCT's transformation initiatives, and the anthropology department for providing the space and the context for posing new questions about the environmental humanities. She says that debates in modernist thought, especially ideas coming from people like Isabel Stengers and the late Bruno Latour, helped to open up some of the intellectual space to pose these new questions.
This afternoon, I was on a 1-hour show with one of South Africa's best journalists, a woman called Rebecca Davis from the Daily Maverick, and on a book I wrote called Corrupted. And in the question time, one of the questions that she posed from somebody, I wish I knew who it was could the speaker tell us whether there is a correlation between the number of dysfunctional universities and the lack of a humanities department? It's a very I said, I really like the question, but but even the universities of technology have a small department of visual arts or something like that. But I know where it was going and so on. I'm so excited about this book. I got to know Lesley a couple of years ago through a mutual friend, Jess Auerbach. She's an incredible scholar, very sharp thinker, very deeply committed scholar. Lesley, can I call you up to receive the Premier Award for the Humanities? I've given Lesley 20 minutes, no, just a few minutes just to say a few.
Thank you so much, colleagues, friends, and what a lovely convivial evening. Thank you to Maputi and the organizers. And what an honor to receive this award. I had to sit down for quite a while when Neil phoned me. So, yeah, I'm so grateful. And it's not been an easy journey. And so really this means a great deal. And I've just wanted to say a few things about the book, and if you've had a look at the book at all, which I hope you guys have, you'll see it begins on a bicycle. And this was a time about 10 years ago when I was a lot fitter than I am now, and I was cycling regularly from Noordhoek past Masipumelele, Ocean View, round the hill Komaki, Misty Cliffs, and on round to Cape Point, Simonstown, and we'd pass Red Hill. And the thing is, when you're cycling in those early morning, misty mornings, and, slow cyclists like me, very, very slow, generally tended to be cycling on my own. So it was kind of me and the dew and the whir of my pedals and my gears. And the thing about cycling in that kind of silence is you are receptive to the stories around you. And that road was taking me through so many stories of the enslaved who had been shipwrecked and formed a farm at Ocean View, stories of tourists, stories of conservation, the arms deal, bobbing in the waves in Simonstown, baboons, the military, beached whales alongside refugee camps for xenophobia, electric fences and tiny bubbling streams in unexpected places. There were shack dwellers and surfers and bin divers. That road connected everything. And, every discipline was there: history, geology, biogeochemistry, trauma, big finance, the arms deal, everything was along that road. And yet, I was cycling and thinking there was no discipline that could hold it together. There was no discipline that could enable me to hold all of that in one picture. And yet, if I looked at the conflicts along the road, what was striking was that the conflicts were precisely around the big picture. And the conflicts were that the big picture was being resolved with little pictures that were never adequate. And the conflicts would continue. And so lived experience, which the Fallists were talking a lot about, was pitted against the best available scientific advice, with enormous frustration resulting, and real battles, which I learned to recognize their shape, whether I was dealing with baboons or fisheries or water, the streams in central Cape Town. There was a pattern of intense rage against academics, particular academics, who were trying their best to resolve a conflict by presenting the best available evidence, and yet that best available evidence was not the big picture. And the lived experience of people in that landscape was pitting itself against the small pictures. And you saw that, that playing out and being abused in some ways. If you think, at the fracking in the Karoo. And I started to look at the debates around fracking 2014, 15, 16. And was astonished to see that in the environmental impact assessments in the USA, the companies had managed to get fracking through by defining fracking as what happened at the point of a drill. And so they could do that. When they did that, they could escape responsibility for the entire landscape destruction, the checkerboarding of farms into tiny roads, the extinctions that would come, the riverine rabbits, the huge pools of contaminated water, the permanent removal of water from the Earth's water cycle. They could evade responsibility for all of that because they would get fracking through by defining it as what happened at the point of the drill. So there was this abuse of reductionist science. So it seemed to me fairly urgent to be able to intervene in environmental conflicts by being able to offer a big picture of lived experience. And more, as I did that, I became aware of the power of relations in a landscape. One of the key thinkers that a lot of us, our beautiful team in EHS, Environmental Humanities South, thank you for being here. The work that we were reading at the time was Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism. And there's a line in there where he says, colonization is thingification. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. It's this reduction of the world to objects set in space and time. That was the key to being able to start to think, rethink the problem by rethinking the categories that modernist thought gives us, object, space, and time. And it was astonishing to see the extent to which the post-colonial thinkers were focused on relations as opposed to objects, and that there was this way of thinking about a landscape in terms of the relations that were there. So whether we're talking about human relations or metamorphoses from biogeochemistry, from flows, changes from action, from movements, change, however slow or beautiful or revolting or violent it might be, change was what we had to start to understand in those landscapes. And so these 6 chapters try to really understand what relations look like in a landscape. Anyway, so that has set the basis of a whole lot of thinking. And after the book came out in 2020, we started writing a grant, which we finally signed off on today. I want to say thank you so much to my team, Frank, Nikiwe, and Paul, some of the graduates who are here, Crane, Mampela. You guys have been rock stars in terms of really, when we've been in a very difficult position, we've been able to come to you for support, and those words of encouragement have been there. And so that project that starts today, coincidentally, is a project with universities in Ethiopia, Tanzania, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and of course Cape Town, to really try to theorize habitability. What does it mean to take account of all those relationships that make a matrix of a landscape livable? So thank you so much to everybody on our team. Thank you to Fiona for nominating the book. And thank you to my beloveds who promised me that if I mentioned them, they'd put a toad in my bed. but lovely to have you here. Thank you. Thanks all.
Neil was very generous in his opening remarks, but I'm not going to be. There are other Humanities Book Awards, and many of them is just complete nonsense. These are not the Patriot Awards or the Patriotic Awards. These are serious awards for independent scholarship. And I want to commend Neil, John, Crane, and the team for sticking in a country that doesn't think very highly about scholarly work and scholarly books. In fact, in this earlier meeting that I referred to, quite a lot of pleasure to move away from the book and just go to, the quick journal articles, even if it is in edited form. I want to say to the younger scholars here, the young academics and so on, make this a goal. May the three people we saw here today, and Lesley with the Apex Award, I hope they serve another function here today, and that is to be role models that values the hard, lonely work of the scholarly book. And as I said to the colleague sitting next to me from the Free State, I said to him, what's your next book about? And people don't normally like that because I just finished the first one, but keep them coming and make sure, as Neil was suggesting, that the second book looks very different from the first and the third from the second. Thank you for supporting the culture of the book. I also want to say this. I'm going to close here, and then you can have dinner and leave whenever you wish. So we're not going to come back to the stage later on. This kind of event is only significant and meaningful to the extent that you show up. And I tell you, I was so excited to see the people here tonight. I mean, to be in a space with somebody who's always been a role model to me, an intellectual, and I seldom use that word because it applies to so few people today, but to have an intellectual of the standard of Mampela Rampele in this room adds gravitas to this function. It adds weight to what we try to do. To have a cosmologist of the standing of George Ellis here adds to the, to the gravitas in the room and so on and so forth. You make the time to come and honor us as the Academy of Science of South Africa, but also to honor the book. And so I can go around the table, my dear friend, Dani Visser, one of the finest legal minds I came to. I only name more recently, more intimately, because of the work we did on a book last year, and what an incredible mind, and so on. I mentioned Wieland earlier. There's many of you here. Thank you, all of you, for being here. My friend who wrote the first book I ever read on masculinity, which blew me away, Rob Morrell. So to all of you, thank you for honoring us, for making this event feel good and feel great, and for supporting the project of the book. So, let's eat, go home, and thank you for being here.